This video contains audio content only. There are no visual elements or images accompanying the audio. If you're expecting to see video footage, please note that this is an intentional audio-only presentation. We recommend listening to this content rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding and enjoy the audio. Welcome, listeners, to a journey through one of history's darkest yet most overlooked chapters. Today, we're delving into the shocking world of medieval European slavery. When we think of slavery, our minds often leap to the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade or the ancient Roman Empire. But nestled between these two eras lies a period where slavery not only persisted but thrived in the heart of Europe. This isn't just a tale of chains and servitude, it's a complex tapestry woven with threads of economics, religion, and evolving social structures. We'll explore how the very foundations of medieval European society were built on the backs of the unfree, from the bustling ports of Venice to the remote fjords of Scandinavia. Prepare to have your preconceptions challenged. Did you know that at one point, slaves made up nearly 20% of England's population? Or that the word slave itself comes from Slav, referring to the people of Eastern Europe who were frequently enslaved? These are just glimpses of the startling realities we'll uncover. We'll journey through time, watching as the nature of slavery transformed from the chattel ownership of Roman times to the serfdom of the High Middle Ages. We'll meet the victims, women and children torn from their homes, and the perpetrators, from Viking raiders to wealthy merchants. We'll see how religious beliefs both justified and challenged the practice of slavery, and how the seeds of modern racial concepts were sown in this era. But this isn't just a history lesson. As we explore the experiences of those who lived in bondage and those who profited from it, we'll confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and society that still resonate today. We'll see how economic pressures, cultural differences, and the quest for power can lead societies to dehumanize and exploit their fellow human beings. So join us as we lift the veil on this hidden aspect of European history. It's a tale of cruelty and resilience, of economic pragmatism and moral questioning, of a society grappling with its own contradictions. By understanding this chapter of our past, we gain invaluable insights into the ongoing struggle for human dignity and freedom. Brace yourselves. The story of medieval European slavery is not for the faint of heart, but it's one that demands to be told. Let's begin. 1. The surprising prevalence of slavery in medieval Europe. When we think of medieval Europe, our minds often conjure images of knights in shining armor, majestic castles, and pious monks in secluded monasteries. But lurking beneath this romanticized veneer was a dark and pervasive reality. Slavery was rampant throughout the continent. This isn't just a footnote in history books, it was a fundamental aspect of medieval European society that shaped economies, social structures, and even the development of early racial concepts. Let's start with a shocking statistic that might make you rethink everything you thought you knew about medieval England. According to historian David Wyatt, at the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, at least 20% of England's population was enslaved. That's 1 in 5 people living in bondage. This flies in the face of the popular notion that Anglo-Saxon England was some kind of freedom-loving utopia. But England wasn't unique. Slavery was a pan-European phenomenon. From the fjords of Scandinavia to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, human beings were bought, sold, and traded like commodities. In fact, the very word slave comes from Slav, referring to the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe who were frequently enslaved during this period. Imagine being so associated with servitude that your ethnic identity becomes synonymous with bondage. The scale of slavery in medieval Europe was staggering. Orlando Patterson, a renowned sociologist, estimates that in mid-10th century Western Europe alone, there were approximately 3.4 million people in bondage. To put that into perspective, that's more than the entire population of the United States at its founding in 1787. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval European slavery wasn't a monolithic institution. It took on different forms and meanings depending on the time and place. In the early Middle Ages, roughly 500–1000 CE, slavery often resembled the chattel slavery of ancient Rome, where slaves were considered property with no legal rights. But as the medieval period progressed, the nature of unfreedom evolved. Take, for example, the curious case of self-sale into slavery. Yes, you heard that right. In some parts of medieval Europe, free individuals would voluntarily sell themselves into slavery, often as a way to escape debt or secure protection from a powerful patron. It's a concept that seems utterly alien to our modern sensibilities, but it speaks to the complex nature of freedom and bondage in medieval society. Religion played a crucial and often contradictory role in the institution of slavery. On one hand, the spread of Christianity was often cited as a reason for the decline of slavery in some regions. The Church generally frowned upon Christians enslaving other Christians. But this didn't lead to the abolition of slavery. Instead, it often meant that slavers simply looked for non-Christian victims. The Vikings, for instance, found a lucrative trade in raiding Slavic pagan communities and selling them to Muslim buyers in the Middle East. Speaking of the Vikings, their role in the medieval slave trade is often overlooked. We tend to think of them as fearsome warriors and explorers, but they were also prolific slavers. The Norse term for slave, thrall, gives us a hint of the grim reality faced by those captured in Viking raids. These thralls weren't just put to work in Scandinavian households, they were a valuable export commodity. Dublin, under Norse control, became one of the largest slave markets in Europe. But slavery wasn't just a rural or frontier phenomenon. It was deeply embedded in urban life as well, especially in the bustling cities of the Mediterranean. Venice, Genoa, and other Italian city-states were major hubs in the medieval slave trade. Between 1414 and 1423 alone, at least 10,000 slaves were sold in Venice. These weren't just servants or agricultural laborers. They were integral to the urban economy, working as artisans, dock workers, and even in specialized roles like eunuchs in wealthy households. The persistence of slavery in medieval Europe challenges our understanding of the period in profound ways. It forces us to confront the fact that societies we often romanticize were built on exploitation and human suffering. It also complicates simplistic narratives about the progress of human rights and freedom. Slavery didn't simply disappear with the fall of Rome, nor did it suddenly emerge with the transatlantic slave trade. Instead, it evolved, adapted, and persisted throughout the medieval period. Understanding the prevalence of slavery in medieval Europe isn't just an academic exercise. It provides crucial context for understanding later developments in European history, from the colonization of the Americas to the development of modern concepts of race and human rights. By confronting this often overlooked aspect of our past, we gain a more nuanced and honest understanding of European history and its global impact. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval European slavery, we'll explore how this institution shaped societies, economies, and individual lives. We'll see how the seeds of later racial ideologies were sown in this period, and how the struggle against slavery has deep roots in European history. The story of medieval European slavery is a reminder that the fight for human dignity and freedom is an ongoing process, one that requires constant vigilance and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about our past. 2. From chattel to serf. The evolution of unfreedom in the Middle Ages. As we journey deeper into the dark underbelly of medieval European society, we encounter a fascinating and often overlooked phenomenon: the gradual transformation of slavery from a system of outright ownership to the more complex institution of serfdom. This shift wasn't a simple, linear progression towards freedom, but rather a nuanced evolution of unfreedom that would shape European society for centuries. Let's start by painting a picture of early medieval slavery. In the wake of the Roman Empire's collapse, slavery in Europe initially resembled the chattel slavery of antiquity. Slaves were considered property, with no legal rights of their own. They could be bought, sold, or even killed at their master's whim. Imagine living in a world where your very existence was at the mercy of another person's caprice. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? But as the medieval period progressed, this stark form of slavery began to change. Several factors contributed to this evolution. The spread of Christianity, while not abolishing slavery outright, did introduce moral qualms about Christians enslaving fellow Christians. Economic changes, including the decline of the monetary economy in many parts of Europe, made it less practical to maintain large numbers of chattel slaves. Enter serfdom. Now, before you start thinking that serfdom was some kind of medieval workers' paradise, let me disabuse you of that notion. Serfs were still unfree, bound to the land they worked and subject to numerous obligations to their lords. But, and this is crucial, they weren't property in the same way chattel slaves had been. Let's break down what life was like for a typical serf. Imagine you're born on a manor in 12th century England. From the moment you draw your first breath, your fate is tied to the land. You can't leave without your lord's permission. You're required to work several days a week on the lord's demesne. That's the part of the estate he keeps for himself. You have to pay various fees and taxes. There's chevauchage for living outside the manor, merchet for marrying off your daughters, Harriet, your best animal, upon your death. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike a chattel slave, you have some rights. You can't be sold separately from the land. You have access to the manor's common areas for grazing animals or collecting firewood. You might even be able to buy your freedom if you're lucky enough to accumulate some wealth. Now, you might be thinking, this doesn't sound much better than slavery. And in many ways, you'd be right. The life of a serf was one of hard labor and limited freedom. But it's crucial to understand that medieval people didn't see the world through our modern lens of individual liberty. For many, the security of being tied to a particular place and social structure outweighed the abstract concept of freedom. This brings us to one of the most counterintuitive aspects of this transition. Some people actually chose to become serfs. I know, it sounds crazy to our modern ears. But in a world of constant warfare, famine, and uncertainty, voluntarily entering into serfdom could provide a measure of security. There are documented cases of free peasants giving up their freedom in exchange for the protection of a powerful lord. But let's not paint too rosy a picture. The transition from slavery to serfdom wasn't a uniform or complete process. In many parts of Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean, outright slavery persisted alongside serfdom well into the later Middle Ages. Venice, for example, remained a major slave trading hub until the 16th century. Moreover, the line between slave and serf could be blurry. Some serfs were treated little better than slaves, while some slaves, especially those in urban areas or with specialized skills, could enjoy a degree of autonomy similar to serfs. The evolution from chattel slavery to serfdom also had profound economic implications. Under the Roman system, slaves had been a key source of labor for large agricultural estates. With the shift to serfdom, European agriculture became dominated by smaller family farms. This change in economic structure would have far-reaching consequences for European society and development. It's also worth noting that this transition wasn't always a one-way street. In times of war or economic hardship, free peasants could find themselves reduced to serfdom or even slavery. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, for instance, led to a resurgence of slavery in parts of Eastern Europe. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of this evolution is how it laid the groundwork for later debates about freedom and rights. As serfdom began to decline in Western Europe in the later Middle Ages, a process that would take centuries and vary greatly by region, the legal and philosophical arguments used to justify or challenge serfdom would inform later discussions about human rights and individual liberty. The transformation from chattel slavery to serfdom in medieval Europe is a testament to the complex and often contradictory nature of human societies. It reminds us that concepts we take for granted, like individual freedom, have a long and complicated history. It also challenges us to think about the nature of freedom itself. Is freedom merely the absence of chains, or does it require economic security and social belonging? As we continue our exploration of medieval European slavery, keep in mind this evolving nature of unfreedom. It's a stark reminder that human societies are capable of both cruelty and adaptation, of creating systems of oppression and finding ways to mitigate them. The story of medieval serfdom is, in many ways, a microcosm of the broader human struggle for dignity and self-determination, a struggle that continues to this day. 3. Women and children in medieval slavery. As we delve deeper into the dark recesses of medieval European slavery, we uncover a particularly harrowing aspect of this institution: the experiences of women and children. Their stories, often overlooked in broader historical narratives, reveal the most intimate and devastating impacts of slavery on human lives and familial bonds. Let's start with a shocking reality. In many parts of medieval Europe, women and children made up the majority of the enslaved population. This wasn't just a quirk of demographics, It was a deliberate choice driven by economic and social factors. Women and children were often seen as more valuable slaves, particularly in domestic settings. They were considered easier to control, less likely to rebel, and in the case of women, had the added benefit of potentially producing more slaves through childbirth. Imagine being a young girl, perhaps no more than 10 or 12 years old, torn from your family and sold into slavery. This was the reality for countless children in medieval Europe. Child slaves were particularly prized in certain markets. In Venice, for instance, young girls from the Caucasus region were highly sought after as domestic servants and potential concubines. These children would grow up in a foreign land, speaking a foreign language, with no hope of ever seeing their families again. For enslaved women, the horrors of their situation were often compounded by sexual exploitation. Many female slaves were expected to serve not just as domestic workers but also as sexual partners for their masters or other men in the household. This sexual abuse was often sanctioned by law and custom. In some areas, the children born to female slaves were automatically considered slaves themselves, regardless of the father's status. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of enslavement that could last for generations. But the story of women in medieval slavery isn't just one of victimhood. There are also tales of remarkable resilience and resistance. Take, for example, the story of Melkorka, an Irish princess who was captured by Vikings and sold into slavery in Iceland. According to the Icelandic sagas, Melkorka initially pretended to be mute, refusing to speak to her captors. She later bore a son to her master, who became a prominent figure in Icelandic history. While we should be cautious about romanticizing such stories, they do provide glimpses of the complex ways enslaved women navigated their circumstances. Children born into slavery faced a particularly cruel fate. From birth, their lives were not their own. They could be separated from their mothers at a young age, sold to different masters, or put to work as soon as they were physically capable. Education, play, and the simple joys of childhood were luxuries few enslaved children could afford. In some cases, enslaved children were used as a form of currency or collateral. There are records of parents selling their children into temporary slavery to pay off debts. While this was often intended as a temporary measure, with the expectation that the child would eventually be freed, the reality was often much grimmer. Many of these children never regained their freedom. The impact of slavery on family structures was devastating. Enslaved women often had to watch helplessly as their children were sold away. Husbands and wives could be separated at their master's whim. The emotional toll of these forced separations is hard to fathom. Yet, despite these challenges, enslaved people still formed families and communities, finding ways to maintain human connections in the most inhuman of circumstances. One particularly disturbing aspect of child slavery in medieval Europe was the practice of castrating young boys to create eunuchs. This horrific procedure, often performed without any form of anesthesia, had a high mortality rate. Those who survived were highly valued as servants in wealthy households, particularly in the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world. Venice became a major center for this gruesome trade, with many of the victims coming from Slavic lands. The experiences of enslaved women and children varied greatly depending on their location and the nature of their enslavement. In urban areas, some skilled female slaves could achieve a degree of autonomy, even accumulating wealth and potentially buying their freedom. In rural settings, the line between enslaved and free women could sometimes be blurry, with both groups facing significant restrictions on their freedom. Religion played a complex role in the lives of enslaved women and children. On one hand, the Church generally opposed the enslavement of Christians by other Christians, which could provide some protection. On the other hand, religious differences were often used to justify enslavement. Muslim women and children captured during the Crusades, for instance, were frequently enslaved by Christian armies. The stories of women and children in medieval European slavery force us to confront the most intimate and personal consequences of this institution. They remind us that slavery wasn't just an economic system or a legal status. It was a lived experience that shattered families, stole childhoods, and inflicted deep psychological wounds that could last for generations. As we reflect on these stories, it's important to recognize that the echoes of this history still resonate today. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women in medieval Europe bears uncomfortable similarities to modern human trafficking. The use of child labor in medieval slavery foreshadows ongoing issues of child exploitation in many parts of the world. Understanding the experiences of women and children in medieval European slavery isn't just about uncovering a hidden aspect of history. It's about recognizing the long roots of gender-based violence and child exploitation, and understanding how systems of oppression have historically targeted the most vulnerable members of society. But amidst these grim realities, we also find stories of incredible resilience. Enslaved women and children weren't just passive victims. They found ways to resist, to maintain their dignity, and to forge connections even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Their stories are a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval European slavery, let's carry with us the memories of these women and children. Their experiences remind us of the very personal, very human cost of slavery, and challenge us to confront the ways in which vulnerability and exploitation continue to intersect in our world today. 4. The economics of the medieval slave trade. When we think of medieval Europe, we often picture a feudal economy based on agriculture and barter. But lurking beneath this surface was a dark and lucrative trade that played a crucial role in shaping the economic landscape of the time: the slave trade. This wasn't just a sideline business. In many areas, it was a cornerstone of economic activity that influenced everything from urban development to international relations. Let's start with a startling fact. At its height, the slave trade was one of the most profitable businesses in medieval Europe. In some regions, the value of the slave trade rivaled or even exceeded that of other major commodities like spices or textiles. This was big business, folks, and it shaped the fortunes of cities, states, and even entire empires. Take Venice, for example. We often think of Venice as the romantic city of canals and gondolas, but in the medieval period, it was also one of the biggest slave markets in Europe. Between 1414 and 1423 alone, at least 10,000 slaves were sold in Venice. That's more than 2 slaves sold every single day for a decade. The profits from this trade helped finance Venice's famous architecture and art, a sobering reminder that much of the beauty we admire in historical cities was built on human suffering. But Venice wasn't alone. Genoa, another Italian maritime powerhouse, was deeply involved in the slave trade, particularly in the Black Sea region. Genoese merchants would buy slaves from the Crimea and other parts of Eastern Europe and sell them in markets across the Mediterranean. This trade was so important to Genoa's economy that when it was disrupted by the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, it contributed to the city's economic decline. Now, you might be wondering, who were these slaves and where did they come from? The answer reveals the truly international nature of the medieval slave trade. Slaves in medieval Europe came from a variety of sources. Many were captured in wars or raids, particularly along the frontiers of Christian Europe. The Vikings were notorious for their slave raids, capturing people from the British Isles, Slavic lands, and even as far afield as North Africa. But warfare wasn't the only source of slaves. Poverty and debt could also lead to enslavement. In some regions, it was legal for people to sell themselves or their children into slavery to pay off debts. Imagine being so desperate that selling your child seemed like the best option. It's a chilling reminder of the harsh realities of medieval life. The slave trade wasn't just about moving people from one place to another. It was a complex economic system that involved a wide range of specialized roles. There were slave hunters who captured people in raids, merchants who bought and sold slaves, ship captains who transported them, and even specialized slave markets in major cities. Each of these roles contributed to a vast economic network that spanned continents. One particularly gruesome aspect of this trade was the market for eunuchs. Castrated male slaves were highly valued in certain markets, particularly in the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world. The demand was so high that some cities, like Verdun in France, became specialized centers for castration. It's estimated that only about 1 in 3 boys survived this brutal procedure. The ones who did could fetch prices up to 10 times higher than non-castrated slaves. The economics of the slave trade had far-reaching effects on medieval society. In some regions, the constant threat of slave raids led to the development of defensive architecture and military strategies. The famous Round Towers of Ireland, for instance, are thought to have been built partly as a defense against Viking slave raids. The slave trade also played a crucial role in diplomatic relations between medieval states. Treaties often included clauses about the treatment of slaves or restrictions on slave raiding. For example, a treaty between Venice and the Carolingian Empire in 840 CE specifically prohibited Venice from buying Christian slaves in the empire or selling Christian slaves to Muslims. But perhaps the most profound economic impact of the medieval slave trade was how it shaped patterns of wealth and power. The profits from slavery allowed certain individuals and families to accumulate vast fortunes. In some cases, this wealth was used to finance other business ventures or to gain political influence. The legacy of this wealth accumulation would continue to shape European society long after the decline of medieval slavery. It's also worth noting that the economics of slavery in medieval Europe weren't static. They evolved over time in response to changing political, religious, and economic conditions. For instance, as the Christian Church became more powerful and influential, there was increasing pressure to end the enslavement of fellow Christians. This didn't end the slave trade, but it did shift its focus to non-Christian populations, particularly from Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. The economics of medieval slavery also laid the groundwork for later forms of exploitation. As direct slavery became less common in parts of Western Europe, it was often replaced by other forms of unfree labor, like serfdom. And of course, the economic structures and justifications developed during this period would later be applied on a much larger scale during the transatlantic slave trade. Understanding the economics of medieval European slavery is crucial for several reasons. First, it challenges our often romanticized view of the Middle Ages, reminding us that this was a period of profound inequality and exploitation. Second, it helps us understand the deep historical roots of economic inequality in Europe and beyond. Finally, it serves as a stark reminder of how economic incentives can lead societies to commit horrific acts of dehumanization. As we reflect on the economics of medieval slavery, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between profit and human rights, questions that remain relevant today. How do we balance economic interests with ethical considerations? What responsibility do we have for the human cost of our economic systems? The story of the medieval European slave trade is not just a tale of numbers and profits. It's a human story, a story of suffering and resilience, of cruelty and resistance. By understanding this history, we gain valuable insights into the complexities of human societies and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. 5. Vikings as slavers. Raids and human trafficking in the north. When we think of Vikings, our minds often conjure images of fearsome warriors in horned helmets, a myth, by the way, raiding coastal villages and monasteries. But there's a darker aspect of Viking society that's often overlooked: their prominent role in the medieval slave trade. The Vikings weren't just raiders and explorers, they were also prolific slavers, and human trafficking played a crucial role in their economy and expansion. Let's start with a shocking fact. Some historians estimate that slaves, or thralls, as the Norse called them, made up as much as 10% of the population in Viking-age Scandinavia. That's 1 in 10 people living in bondage. But the Vikings didn't just keep slaves. They were major players in a vast slave trading network that stretched from the British Isles to the Middle East. The Viking slave raids were notorious for their brutality. Imagine you're a peaceful farmer or monk living in coastal England or Ireland in the 9th century. Suddenly, longships appear on the horizon. Before you can react, fierce warriors are storming your village or monastery. Those who resist are killed, and the survivors, men, women, and children, are bound and dragged onto the ships. This wasn't just plunder, it was a calculated business operation. These raids weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned expeditions designed to capture as many potential slaves as possible. The Vikings specifically targeted areas with dense populations and poor defenses. Monasteries were particularly favored targets, not just for their wealth but because the monks and nuns made desirable slaves due to their literacy and skills. But the Vikings didn't just raid for slaves, they also engaged in a bustling slave trade. Dublin, founded by Norse settlers, became one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Here, slaves from all over the Viking world, Irish, English, Slavic, and others, were bought and sold. The scale of this trade was enormous. The Arabic chronicler Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, visiting Prague in 965, reported seeing Viking merchants with wagon loads of slaves and tin. The Viking slave trade wasn't just a regional phenomenon, it was part of a vast international network. Vikings sold slaves to buyers as far away as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. In fact, the demand for slaves in these wealthy eastern markets was a major driver of Viking raiding and trading activities. One of the most valuable commodities in this trade were young women and girls. They were particularly prized in the harems of the Middle East. The famous Viking ruler Harald Hardrada, who would later die trying to conquer England in 1066, made much of his fortune selling Slavic slaves to the Byzantine Empire. But not all slaves in Viking society were captured in raids. Some were born into slavery, as the children of thralls were automatically considered slaves. Others fell into slavery due to debt or as punishment for crimes. There are even accounts of people voluntarily selling themselves into slavery during times of famine, seeing it as preferable to starvation. Life as a slave in Viking society was harsh. Thralls had no legal rights and could be bought, sold, or killed at their master's whim. They performed the hardest and most dangerous work, from mining and quarrying to the back-breaking labor of clearing new farmland. Female slaves often faced sexual exploitation in addition to their other duties. However, the status of slaves in Viking society wasn't always permanent. Unlike in some other slaveholding societies, it was possible for Viking thralls to earn their freedom. Some were freed by their masters as a reward for loyal service. Others were able to buy their freedom if they managed to accumulate enough wealth. There are even stories of slaves rising to positions of prominence after gaining their freedom. The importance of slavery in Viking society is reflected in their mythology. The Norse creation myth tells of the god Heimdall disguising himself as a human named Rig and fathering the progenitors of the three classes of Norse society: thralls, slaves, carls, freemen, and jarls, nobles. This myth not only acknowledged the existence of slavery but presented it as a divinely ordained part of the social order. The Viking slave trade had far-reaching consequences beyond Scandinavia. It played a crucial role in the Norse colonization of Iceland, where many of the first settlers brought slaves with them. It also contributed to the genetic diversity of Iceland. Recent DNA studies have shown that a significant proportion of Icelandic women's DNA is of Celtic origin, likely from female slaves brought from Ireland and Scotland. The Vikings' involvement in the slave trade also had significant economic impacts. The wealth generated from selling slaves helped fund Viking expansion and exploration. It paid for the ships that carried Norse settlers to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. In a very real sense, the Viking Age was built on the backs of slaves. But the Viking slave trade wasn't just about economics, it also had profound cultural impacts. As Vikings settled in new lands, they often brought slaves with them, leading to cultural and linguistic exchanges. For example, some historians argue that the Celtic influence on Icelandic culture can be partly attributed to the large number of Irish slaves brought to the island. The legacy of Viking slavery continued long after the Viking Age ended. The Norse word for slave, thrall, entered the English language and is still used today to mean someone who is in moral or mental servitude. More significantly, the roots and networks established by Viking slavers laid the groundwork for later medieval slave trading operations. Understanding the role of slavery in Viking society challenges our often romanticized view of Norse culture. It reminds us that even societies we might admire for their achievements or adventurous spirit were capable of profound cruelty and exploitation. It's a stark reminder of the complex and often contradictory nature of human societies. The story of Viking slavery also provides valuable insights into the broader history of human trafficking. It shows how economic incentives can drive the exploitation of vulnerable populations, a pattern that sadly continues to this day. By studying this history, we can better understand the roots of modern human trafficking and perhaps find more effective ways to combat it. As we reflect on the Vikings' role as slavers, we're reminded of the importance of confronting the dark chapters in our shared human history. It's not about assigning blame to modern descendants of Vikings or their victims, but about understanding the full complexity of our past. Only by acknowledging these difficult truths can we hope to build a more just and equitable future. 6. Religion and race. Justifications for medieval slavery. In our journey through the dark corridors of medieval European slavery, we now come to one of the most complex and controversial aspects of this institution: the role of religion and emerging concepts of race in justifying and perpetuating slavery. This is a story that challenges our modern understandings of both faith and identity, revealing how deeply intertwined these concepts were with the practice of human bondage in medieval Europe. Let's start with a fundamental question. How did medieval Europeans, particularly Christians, reconcile the practice of slavery with their religious beliefs? The answer is both fascinating and disturbing. Despite Christianity's emphasis on human equality before God, medieval Christian thinkers found ways to justify slavery through complex theological arguments. One common justification was the idea that slavery was a consequence of sin. This argument traced back to the biblical story of Noah cursing his son Ham to be a servant of servants. Some medieval theologians interpreted this as a divine sanction for slavery. This interpretation would later be used to justify the enslavement of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, but in medieval Europe, it was applied more broadly. Another religious justification for slavery was the concept of just war. According to this idea, it was morally acceptable to enslave people captured in a war that was considered just in the eyes of God. This conveniently allowed Christian powers to enslave Muslims captured during the Crusades, for example. Bernard of Clairvaux, a prominent 12th century theologian, went so far as to argue that killing a Muslim wasn't homicide but malicide, the extermination of evil. But here's where it gets really interesting. While religion was used to justify slavery, it also provided some of the earliest arguments against it. The Church generally opposed the enslavement of Christians by other Christians. This led to some bizarre situations. For instance, there are records of slave traders in Venice baptizing their slaves just before selling them to Muslim buyers, presumably to ease their consciences about selling Christians. The religious dimension of slavery in medieval Europe wasn't limited to Christianity. In the Iberian Peninsula, which was under Muslim rule for much of the Middle Ages, Islamic law played a crucial role in shaping slavery practices. While Islam, like Christianity, didn't oppose slavery outright, it did provide certain protections for slaves and encouraged their manumission as an act of piety. Now, let's talk about race. It's a common misconception that racial ideologies only emerged with the transatlantic slave trade. In reality, the seeds of later racial thinking were already being sown in medieval Europe, often intertwined with religious categorizations. One of the most striking examples of this is the treatment of sub-Saharan Africans in medieval European art and literature. From the mid-13th century onward, we see a growing tendency to depict Africans in negative ways, often as the torturers of Christ or the killers of John the Baptist. This wasn't just artistic license, it reflected and reinforced emerging ideas about the inherent characteristics of different peoples. But race in medieval Europe wasn't just about skin color. Religious and cultural differences were often racialized. Jews, for instance, were frequently depicted as physically distinct, with hooked noses and dark skin, despite the fact that many European Jews would have been indistinguishable from their Christian neighbors in reality. The treatment of Muslims in medieval European thought is another fascinating case study in the interplay between religion and proto-racial thinking. Muslims were often described in bestial terms, as subhuman or monstrous. This dehumanization made it easier to justify their enslavement or killing. One of the most intriguing aspects of medieval European attitudes towards race and slavery is the case of the Caucasian slave women who were highly prized in Islamic Spain. These women, often blonde and blue-eyed, were seen as exotic and desirable. Some even became influential as mothers of Arab Muslim rulers. This complex dynamic challenges our modern associations between whiteness and power. The intersection of religion and proto-racial thinking in medieval slavery had far-reaching consequences. It laid the groundwork for later, more explicit racial ideologies that would be used to justify the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism. The idea that certain peoples were naturally suited for slavery, or that enslavement could be justified as a means of conversion or civilization, has its roots in these medieval concepts. But it's crucial to understand that medieval ideas about race were not the same as modern racial categories. They were more fluid, more tied to culture and religion than to fixed biological characteristics. A person's race could change if they converted to a different religion or adopted different cultural practices. One of the most shocking examples of how religion and proto-racial thinking intersected in medieval slavery comes from the Crusades. When Christian crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, they massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. But they spared the city's black African Christians, the Ethiopians, seeing them as potential allies against Islam. This shows how religious identity could sometimes trump what we might think of as racial categories. The evolving concepts of race and religion in medieval Europe also had a profound impact on the geography of the slave trade. As it became increasingly taboo to enslave fellow Christians, slavers turned their attention to pagan lands in Eastern Europe and the Baltic. The very word, slave, comes from Slav, reflecting the large numbers of Slavic peoples enslaved during this period. One particularly disturbing development was the emergence of pseudo-scientific justifications for slavery. For instance, some medieval thinkers argued that people from hot climates were naturally lazy and thus suited for slavery, while those from cold climates were too stupid and those from temperate zones, like Europe, were just right for freedom. These ideas, while not based on skin color per se, laid the groundwork for later racial pseudoscience. The complex interplay between religion and emerging racial concepts in medieval Europe challenges us to think more deeply about the roots of modern racism and religious intolerance. It shows us that these ideas didn't appear out of nowhere with the transatlantic slave trade or European colonialism, but have a long and complex history. Understanding this history is crucial for several reasons. First, it helps us see how deeply ingrained ideas about human difference and hierarchy are in Western culture. Second, it challenges simplistic narratives about the relationship between religion and slavery, showing that religious thought could be used both to justify and to challenge the institution. Finally, it reminds us that concepts we often take for granted, like race, have a history and are not fixed or natural categories. As we grapple with ongoing issues of racism and religious intolerance in our world today, the history of medieval European slavery serves as a sobering reminder of how dangerous it can be to categorize and dehumanize groups of people. It challenges us to question our own assumptions and to remain vigilant against the misuse of religion or pseudo-scientific ideas to justify oppression and exploitation. The story of religion and race in medieval European slavery is not just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. By confronting this history, we gain valuable insights into the origins of some of our most persistent social problems. More importantly, we're reminded of the ongoing need to challenge and dismantle systems of oppression, wherever and however they manifest. 7. Daily life and experiences of medieval slaves. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval European slavery, it's crucial that we don't lose sight of the human beings at the center of this institution. Behind the economic statistics and theological justifications were real people, each with their own hopes, fears, and daily struggles. Let's try to reconstruct, as best we can from the available sources, what daily life might have been like for a slave in medieval Europe. Imagine waking up at dawn in a cramped, dank outbuilding on a large estate in 12th century France. You're a slave, or serf, as they're starting to call it now, and your day of backbreaking labor is about to begin. Your stomach growls. The meager rations you're given barely keep you alive, let alone satisfied. But there's no time to dwell on your hunger. The overseer's whip cracks, urging you and your fellow slaves to the fields. The work is relentless and brutal. From sunrise to sunset, you're expected to toil in the fields, tending to your master's crops. The tools are primitive and the work is backbreaking. Your hands are calloused and scarred, your back permanently bent from years of labor. But you dare not slack off. The consequences for laziness can be severe, ranging from beatings to reduced rations to being sold away from your family. Speaking of family, that's one of the few sources of solace in your harsh life. But even this is tenuous. Your master has the right to sell you or your loved ones at any time. You've seen it happen to others: children torn from their parents, husbands separated from wives. The fear of such separation hangs over you constantly, adding emotional anguish to your physical hardships. But not all slaves worked in rural settings. If you were a domestic slave in an urban household, your experience might be quite different. You might have more varied tasks, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and possibly better living conditions. But you'd also be under constant supervision, with little to no privacy. And for female slaves, there was the ever-present threat of sexual exploitation by their masters or other men in the household. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of slave life was the lack of control over one's own body. Slaves could be physically punished at their master's whim. They had no say in who they married or if they married at all. Female slaves, in particular, were often viewed as breeding stock, expected to produce more slaves for their masters. Education and literacy were usually out of reach for slaves, though there were exceptions. Some domestic slaves, particularly in wealthy households, might learn to read or write as part of their duties. But for most, the world of learning was as closed to them as the world of freedom. Religion played a complex role in the lives of slaves. On one hand, Christianity, the dominant religion in medieval Europe, preached equality before God and offered some slaves a source of hope and spiritual solace. On the other hand, it was often used to justify their enslavement and encourage obedience to their masters. Some slaves found ways to blend their traditional beliefs with Christianity, creating unique syncretic practices. One aspect of slave life that's often overlooked is the development of slave communities and cultures. Despite the harsh conditions, slaves found ways to maintain their humanity. They created their own music, stories, and traditions. They formed bonds of friendship and mutual support. These communities provided a crucial source of resilience and resistance in the face of oppression. Speaking of resistance, it's important to note that slaves weren't just passive victims. There were numerous slave revolts throughout medieval Europe, though they were usually brutally suppressed. More common were smaller acts of resistance, working slowly, pretending not to understand orders, or even sabotaging tools or crops. Some slaves attempted to escape, though the chances of success were slim and the punishments for failed attempts were severe. The experiences of slaves could vary greatly depending on their specific circumstances. A skilled artisan slave in a city might have a degree of autonomy and even the opportunity to earn money towards buying their freedom. A slave in a mine or quarry, on the other hand, might face some of the harshest conditions imaginable, with a life expectancy measured in just a few years. One particularly heart-wrenching aspect of medieval slave life was the experience of child slaves. Children born to slave parents inherited their status and were put to work as soon as they were physically capable, often around age 5 or 6. Their childhoods were stolen from them, replaced by labor and hardship. It's also worth noting that the line between slave and free wasn't always clear-cut in medieval Europe. There were various gradations of unfreedom, and someone's status could change over time. Some slaves were able to buy their freedom or were manumitted by their masters. However, even freed slaves often faced discrimination and limited opportunities. The psychological toll of slavery was immense. Living in a state of constant fear and degradation had profound effects on mental health. Many slaves likely suffered from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The generational trauma of slavery would have long-lasting impacts on families and communities. Yet amidst all this suffering, there were also stories of remarkable resilience and even achievement. Some slaves managed to gain positions of trust and responsibility. There are records of slave artisans producing beautiful works of art, of slave musicians entertaining courts, even of slaves rising to advisory positions in royal households. As we try to understand the daily lives of medieval slaves, we're confronted with the limits of our historical sources. Most of what we know comes from documents written by the slave-owning class, not by the slaves themselves. We have to read between the lines, look for clues in archaeological evidence, and use our empathy and imagination to fill in the gaps. Reconstructing the daily lives of medieval slaves isn't just an academic exercise. It's a way of honoring their humanity, of acknowledging the suffering they endured and the contributions they made to society, often against their will. It's also a stark reminder of the capacity for cruelty that exists within human societies, and the ongoing need to fight against exploitation and oppression in all its forms. As we reflect on the lives of medieval slaves, we're challenged to consider how the echoes of this history still resonate today. The struggle for human dignity and freedom didn't end with the decline of medieval slavery. It continues in various forms around the world, reminding us that the fight against human exploitation is an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance and commitment. 8. How medieval slavery shaped later racial concepts. As we near the end of our journey through the dark world of medieval European slavery, we come to perhaps its most enduring and insidious legacy: the role it played in shaping later concepts of race. This is a complex and often overlooked aspect of medieval slavery, but understanding it is crucial for comprehending the roots of modern racial ideologies. Let's start with a provocative statement. The seeds of modern racism were sown in the soil of medieval European slavery. Now, before you think I'm suggesting that medieval Europeans had the same concepts of race that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, let me be clear, they didn't. But the ideas and practices that developed around medieval slavery laid important groundwork for later racial thinking. One of the key developments was the increasing association between slavery and certain ethnic or cultural groups. In the early Middle Ages, anyone could potentially become a slave, regardless of their origin. But over time, certain groups became more closely associated with slave status. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, for instance, were so frequently enslaved that their ethnic name became the root of the word slave in many European languages. This association between ethnicity and slavery wasn't based on skin color in the way later racial categories would be. Instead, it was often tied to religious and cultural differences. Non-Christians were seen as legitimate targets for enslavement by many European Christians. This created a kind of proto-racial thinking where certain groups were seen as naturally suited for slavery. The treatment of sub-Saharan Africans in medieval European thought and art is particularly telling. From the 13th century onward, we see a growing tendency to depict Africans in negative ways in European art. They were often portrayed as the torturers of Christ or as demons. While this wasn't a fully formed concept of race as we understand it today, it was certainly laying the groundwork for later racist ideologies. Another crucial development was the emergence of pseudo-scientific justifications for slavery. Some medieval thinkers argued that people from different climates had different natural dispositions that made them more or less suited for slavery. People from hot climates, they claimed, were naturally lazy and thus suited for enslavement, while those from cold climates were too stupid, and those from temperate zones, like Europe, were just right for freedom. These ideas might sound absurd to us now, but they were important precursors to the scientific racism that would emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries. They established the dangerous precedent of using supposedly objective criteria to justify the subjugation of certain groups. The medieval slave trade also contributed to the development of later racial thinking in more subtle ways. As European slavers traveled to different parts of the world to capture or purchase slaves, they encountered diverse peoples and cultures. Their accounts of these encounters, often exaggerated or misunderstood, helped shape European ideas about human difference. For example, the 13th century explorer Marco Polo's descriptions of the peoples he encountered on his travels were widely read and influential. While Polo himself didn't explicitly promote racial hierarchies, his accounts of monstrous races and strange customs contributed to a worldview that saw non-Europeans as fundamentally different and often inferior. The Crusades, too, played a role in shaping proto-racial ideas. The prolonged conflict between Christians and Muslims led to the development of stark us versus them mentalities. Muslims were often portrayed in bestial terms, as subhuman or monstrous. This dehumanization made it easier to justify their enslavement or killing, and it laid the groundwork for later racial stereotypes about Middle Eastern peoples. But perhaps the most significant way in which medieval slavery shaped later racial concepts was through the development of legal and social systems designed to manage slave populations. These systems, which defined who could be enslaved and under what circumstances, established precedents for the legal codification of racial categories that would occur in later centuries. For instance, in some parts of medieval Europe, the child of a slave mother and a free father would be born a slave, regardless of the father's status. This principle of inheritance of slave status through the maternal line would later be applied to race in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, with devastating consequences. It's also worth noting that the medieval European slave trade created some of the first sustained interactions between Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans. While these interactions didn't immediately lead to the development of modern racial categories, they did begin to shape European perceptions of Africans in ways that would influence later racial thinking. The legacy of medieval slavery in shaping racial concepts wasn't limited to Europe. As Europeans began to colonize other parts of the world, they brought with them ideas and practices that had roots in medieval slavery. The encomienda system in Spanish America, for instance, which granted colonists the labor of indigenous people, had clear parallels with medieval European serfdom. It's crucial to understand that the development of racial thinking wasn't a straightforward or inevitable process. There were always voices that challenged these emerging ideas, arguing for human equality and against the institution of slavery. The medieval period saw some of the earliest European arguments against slavery, often based on Christian principles of human dignity and equality before God. Understanding how medieval slavery shaped later racial concepts is more than just an academic exercise. It helps us see how deeply rooted racist ideas are in Western culture, and how they evolved over time. This understanding is crucial for addressing ongoing issues of racism and discrimination in our societies today. Moreover, recognizing the medieval roots of racial thinking challenges simplistic narratives about the history of racism. It shows us that racist ideas didn't simply appear fully formed with the transatlantic slave trade or European colonialism, but have a long and complex history. This understanding can help us better combat these ideas by addressing their deep historical roots. As we reflect on this aspect of medieval slavery's legacy, we're reminded of the power of ideas to shape society, for better or worse. The proto-racial concepts that emerged in the context of medieval slavery had real, devastating consequences for millions of people in subsequent centuries. This serves as a stark warning about the dangers of categorizing and dehumanizing groups of people. At the same time, understanding this history can be empowering. It reminds us that concepts we often take for granted, like race, are not natural or inevitable, but are products of specific historical circumstances. And if these ideas were constructed, they can also be deconstructed. This knowledge challenges us to critically examine our own assumptions about human difference and to work towards building more just and equitable societies. The story of how medieval slavery shaped later racial concepts is a sobering reminder of the long shadow cast by historical injustices. But it's also a call to action, urging us to confront this difficult history head-on and to use our understanding of the past to create a better future. 9. The decline of slavery in medieval Europe. As we come to the final chapter of our exploration into medieval European slavery, we encounter a puzzling phenomenon: the gradual decline of this brutal institution. This wasn't a sudden abolition or a clear-cut victory for human rights. Instead, it was a complex, uneven process that unfolded over centuries, shaped by a myriad of economic, religious, and social factors. Let's start with a surprising fact. By the end of the medieval period, chattel slavery had largely disappeared from many parts of Western Europe. This doesn't mean that exploitation and unfree labor vanished, far from it. But the outright ownership of human beings became increasingly rare. How and why did this happen? The answer is far from simple. One key factor was the spread of Christianity. Now, before you think this is a straightforward story of religious enlightenment, let me complicate the picture. The Christian Church's relationship with slavery was deeply ambiguous. On one hand, Christian teachings about human equality before God provided some of the earliest arguments against slavery. On the other hand, the Church was often complicit in slave-holding and the slave trade. However, as Christianity became more established in Europe, there was growing discomfort with the idea of Christians enslaving fellow Christians. This led to a gradual shift where slavery became increasingly associated with religious difference. In other words, it became more acceptable to enslave non-Christians, but less so to enslave Christians. This religious dimension had some surprising consequences. There are records of slave traders in Venice baptizing their slaves just before selling them to Muslim buyers, presumably to ease their consciences about selling Christians. In some cases, slaves could gain their freedom by converting to Christianity, though this was far from a universal practice. Economic factors also played a crucial role in the decline of slavery. As the medieval period progressed, the European economy began to change. The monetary economy revived, trade expanded, and new forms of labor organization emerged. In many areas, it simply became more economically efficient to employ wage laborers or serfs rather than to maintain slaves. The rise of feudalism was particularly significant in this regard. Under the feudal system, serfs were tied to the land rather than owned outright. While serfdom was still a form of unfree labor, it offered more rights and protections than chattel slavery. Many historians see the transition from slavery to serfdom as a key step in the decline of outright slavery in medieval Europe. But let's not paint too rosy a picture here. The decline of slavery was a slow, uneven process, and it didn't happen everywhere at the same time. In some parts of Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean, slavery persisted well into the late medieval and even early modern periods. Venice, for example, remained a major slave trading hub until the 16th century. Moreover, as slavery declined in some areas, it intensified in others. The late medieval period saw an expansion of slave raiding and trading in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. This shift was partly driven by the increasing reluctance to enslave fellow Christians in Western Europe, leading slavers to look further afield for their human cargo. One of the most intriguing aspects of the decline of medieval European slavery is how it set the stage for later forms of exploitation. As direct chattel slavery became less common, other forms of unfree or coerced labor took its place. Serfdom, indentured servitude, and various forms of debt bondage became more prevalent. In many ways, these systems preserved many of the exploitative aspects of slavery while adapting to changing economic and social conditions. The decline of slavery in medieval Europe wasn't a linear process. There were periods of resurgence, often tied to warfare and conquest. The Crusades, for instance, led to an increase in the enslavement of Muslims by Christians, and vice versa. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire into southeastern Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries also resulted in large-scale enslavement. It's also crucial to understand that the decline of slavery in medieval Europe didn't mean an end to European involvement in slavery. As slavery was becoming less common within Europe, European traders were beginning to participate in the Atlantic slave trade, which would eventually dwarf the medieval slave trade in scale and brutality. In a grim irony, some of the arguments and justifications developed to explain why Europeans shouldn't enslave other Europeans were repurposed to justify the enslavement of Africans. The role of law in the decline of slavery is particularly fascinating. Throughout the medieval period, we see a gradual evolution of legal codes dealing with slavery. In many areas, these laws became increasingly complex and restrictive, making it more difficult to keep slaves or to enter into slavery. For example, some legal codes limited the circumstances under which people could be enslaved for debt or as punishment for crimes. One of the most significant legal developments was the principle of free soil that emerged in some parts of Europe. This idea held that any slave who set foot on the territory of certain kingdoms or cities would automatically become free. While this principle was not universally applied and often had exceptions, it represented an important conceptual shift in thinking about slavery and freedom. The decline of slavery also had profound impacts on European society and culture. As slavery became less common, the social hierarchies and economic systems that had been built around it had to adapt. This contributed to the development of new forms of social organization and labor relations that would shape European society for centuries to come. It's important to note that the decline of slavery didn't necessarily mean an improvement in conditions for the lowest classes of society. In many cases, the lot of serfs or landless laborers was not significantly better than that of slaves. The end of formal slavery often meant a shift to other forms of exploitation rather than true liberation. The psychological and cultural impacts of this transition are harder to trace but no less significant. As outright slavery became less acceptable in many parts of Europe, it necessitated new ways of thinking about human worth, labor, and social hierarchies. These changing mindsets would play a crucial role in shaping later debates about rights, freedom, and the nature of human dignity. One of the most poignant aspects of the decline of medieval European slavery is the stories of the last slaves. In some regions, we have records of the final slave sales or the manumission of the last officially recognized slaves. These individual stories serve as powerful reminders of the human cost of slavery and the long, difficult road to its abolition. It's also worth considering how the decline of slavery in medieval Europe influenced, or failed to influence, slavery practices in other parts of the world. While slavery was becoming less common in much of Europe, it remained a significant institution in many other societies, including in the Islamic world and various African kingdoms. The reasons for these divergent paths are complex and still debated by historians. As we reflect on the decline of slavery in medieval Europe, it's crucial to resist simplistic narratives of progress or enlightenment. The end of widespread chattel slavery in Europe was not an inevitable result of moral advancement, but a complex process shaped by a multitude of factors. Understanding this complexity is essential for grappling with the ongoing legacy of slavery and the persistence of other forms of exploitation in our world today. The story of slavery's decline in medieval Europe is, in many ways, a story of unintended consequences and incremental changes. Religious ideas, economic shifts, legal evolution, and changing social norms all played a role. It's a reminder that major social transformations often happen not through sudden revolutions, but through the slow accumulation of smaller changes over time. At the same time, the incomplete and uneven nature of this decline serves as a sobering reminder of the persistence of human exploitation. Even as outright slavery was fading in many parts of Europe, new forms of unfree labor were emerging. This challenges us to think critically about the various forms of coercion and exploitation that exist in our own societies, even in the absence of formal slavery. Understanding the decline of slavery in medieval Europe is more than just an academic exercise. It provides valuable insights into how deeply entrenched social institutions can change over time. It challenges us to think about the complex interplay of economic, social, religious, and legal factors in shaping human societies. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the struggle against human exploitation is an ongoing process, one that requires constant vigilance and commitment. As we conclude our exploration of medieval European slavery, we're left with a complex legacy. The decline of slavery in this period represented a significant shift in human history, yet it also laid the groundwork for new forms of exploitation and the expansion of slavery in other parts of the world. It's a legacy that continues to shape our world today, reminding us of both the possibility of change and the ongoing need to fight against all forms of human bondage. Key takeaways and broader implications. As we conclude our journey through the dark and complex world of medieval European slavery, we're left with a profoundly altered understanding of this period in history. The prevalence and persistence of slavery in medieval Europe challenges our often romanticized views of this era, forcing us to confront the harsh realities that underpinned the grand cathedrals and chivalric ideals. Our exploration has revealed that slavery was not a marginal institution in medieval Europe, but a fundamental aspect of its economy and society. From the thrall in a Viking longhouse to the Slavic captive in a Venetian market, slaves were an integral part of the medieval world. This realization compels us to reevaluate our understanding of medieval European society and its power structures. Perhaps most striking is how the study of medieval slavery illuminates the deep historical roots of concepts we often associate with later periods. The seeds of racial thinking, the complex relationship between religion and bondage, and the economic structures that enable human exploitation. All these have their antecedents in medieval European slavery. At the same time, tracing the gradual decline of slavery in medieval Europe offers valuable insights into how deeply entrenched social institutions can change over time. It's a reminder that progress is often slow and uneven, but also that change is possible even in the face of long-standing traditions and powerful vested interests. The legacy of medieval European slavery extends far beyond the Middle Ages. It shaped the legal and social structures that would later be applied in European colonies around the world. It influenced the development of economic systems and labor practices, and its echoes can still be heard in ongoing debates about race, religion, and human rights. Understanding this history is crucial for several reasons. It helps us better comprehend the complexities of human societies and the often contradictory forces that shape them. It challenges us to think critically about our own assumptions and the historical narratives we've inherited. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of the ongoing need to fight against all forms of human exploitation and injustice. As we reflect on what we've learned, we're challenged to consider how the echoes of this history still resonate in our world today. How do the legacies of medieval slavery continue to shape our societies? What lessons can we draw from this history to address contemporary forms of exploitation and inequality? These are not easy questions, but grappling with them is essential if we're to build more just and equitable societies. By understanding the deep historical roots of issues like racism, economic exploitation, and religious intolerance, we're better equipped to address these challenges in our own time. The story of medieval European slavery is not just a tale of the past. It's a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. It shows us the depths of cruelty we're capable of, but also our capacity for change and progress. It reminds us that the struggle for human dignity and freedom is an ongoing process, one that requires constant vigilance and commitment. As we close this chapter, I encourage you to carry these insights with you. Let them inform your understanding of history and your engagement with contemporary issues. And remember, the study of history is not just about the past, it's about understanding ourselves and shaping our future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. I hope it has been as enlightening for you as it has been challenging. If you found this exploration valuable, please consider sharing it with others. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the complexities of human history and culture. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a more just and equitable world.